sheet to pass out tonight, but we do have several things that we're going to cover tonight. I kind of rushed through those last few, 8 chapters, I think, last week. That may be a record for me to cover in a week's time, but I really don't want to repeat what I covered last week. So I pulled out some things really from the book of Joshua that are different that we have not covered yet. And we're going to look at just several different directions, a little bit of hodgepodge tonight if you don't mind. One of the things we're going to do is take a look at some of the New Testament references in Joshua, but also some Old Testament references in the book of Joshua. And so we're going to kind of go through several of those things. And we're going to close tonight with looking at the theme of being strong and courageous. And we'll look through, kind of walk through the Bible of that theme, some other references of that throughout the Bible. So hope that you bear with me. Again, we were supposed to have Paul Gerber come speak tonight and give us an update on the work. And he was going to be meeting with the elders beforehand and then giving us an update tonight. And he passed away last week. And we did receive word that the funeral is going to be Saturday. And I believe it's going to be at Creve Hall in Nashville. But I don't know that for sure. We didn't get that specifically there. But we did get word from his wife, just thanking the congregation and for understanding there, and they'll try to send up some of the report of the work at a later time. And one of the other gentlemen that has kind of been here in the States has helped him coordinate some of those things. He'll probably be coming to give us a little bit of an update at a later time. How many of you ever have seen some of the, it's called the Bible Project, some of their videos? Several of you, I knew Derek would have. What they do different videos on different things, but one of the things I've always appreciated anytime I've studied a book is to take a look at their summary of that book. And if you haven't seen those videos, I'm going to show one to you tonight of Joshua. Basically, it's just a summary of that whole book, and it's kind of in animation form, and so it's interesting to look at. But one thing I want you to think about while you're looking at this is I'll be curious when we get through with it, as we step through the Joshua, now that we've kind of studied all of Joshua, just would be curious, what are those areas that jumped out to you from our study in Joshua? And so we'll get some input from that after the video. But we're going to attempt to do this, and if it doesn't work, then we'll just keep rolling. So let's go to this next slide. Okay. All right. Good deal.
The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescued Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai, and he brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land, and Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died and Israel's ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with 4 main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land, and then once they're there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites, and so they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as the inheritance for the 12 tribes, And then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in and we'll see how all of it flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given at Mount Sinai. And then Joshua sends spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land. Just like the sea parted for Moses in the Exodus, so here the river Jordan parts and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now, in chapter 5, the story transitions. So the people look back to their roots as God's covenant people, and so the new generation is circumcised and they celebrate their first Passover in the land. But then they turn and prepare to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior, who, it turns out, is the angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us, or are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither," which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on God's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan, which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups, and the first part retells the story of 2 battles in detail, and that's followed by a series of short stories that condense years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first 2 battles are against Jericho and then Ai, and they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach. So they let God's presence in the ark lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rahab turned to the God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same, but they don't. And so on the 7th day, the priests blow the trumpets and the walls come falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle at Ai makes the opposite point. So there's this Israelite named Achan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone, and then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move after all that God has done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai, and they're totally defeated. And it's only after humble repentance and severely dealing with Achan's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these 2 stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment. Now, the second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rahab did as they turn to follow the God of Israel and they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all of these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with this summary list of all of these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now, let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them, they're going to bother you. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reasons are actually given earlier in the biblical story. It's that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely morally corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practiced child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to influence Israel. The Canaanites had to go. Which raises the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites, like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrases used in these stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivor or anything that breathed. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly hyperbole and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Israel is first told to drive out the Canaanites, but then to totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. So for example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later in chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still populated by Canaanites. And so what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic language as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit what we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab or the Gibeonites. God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories mark a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. And so the purpose of these battle stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence in God's name. Rather, they show God bringing his justice on human evil at a unique moment in history and how he delivered Israel from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now, let's go back to the book's design. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of this section is like lists of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Abraham, that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives two speeches to the people. They're very similar to the final speeches of Moses in Deuteronomy. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they're unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. They'll be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is Israel going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.
I don't know if you've seen those before, but I appreciate the summary there. It kind of breaks it down kind of simply in kind of a simple form. Let me ask, first of all, is there anything on there that you had pause about or a question about there? It did me too. Let me bring your attention to Joshua 11. There's a few things, and I watched that a couple times, and I don't know that the Bible clearly states it like that. In other words, is it hyperbole there? A couple things we do know though. Joshua 11, verse 15, just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So we know this statement here. We also can know some situations like at AI or I, where when God told them specifically to do something, and there were times that he told them to utterly destroy. And they did utterly destroy. But then there were other times, like at Ai or I, that they did not follow God's word and they were punished. So later on we see, and we pointed out last week, that there were times when Joshua even acknowledged these other people that were living among them. Kevin?
Chapter 11, verse 10 and 11. Joshua turned back at that time, took Hazor, struck its king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms, and they struck all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroyed them. There was none left breathing, and then he burned them with fire. I don't think that's hyperbole.
No, and there are times when they were told to utterly destroy. But there are other times when we see that they left the people. But here in verse 15, it says that Joshua did all that was commanded. So, I mean, just stating facts, I don't know if the way it was stated, I would totally agree. It caused me pause as well. But stating facts, we do know that God blessed them, that it was said that Joshua did all that was done. Now, there were commands, and we covered those last week in chapters 22, 23, and 24 concerning the people that were still left among them. And that is true, that it coincides with Deuteronomy, that they were to not intermarry and those kind of things. And so that's probably something worth studying further. Setting that aside, what jumps out to you about the book of Joshua? What were some of those things that you remember from this summary or whatever that really made an impact on you? Joshua's obedience. Okay, what else? Okay. Okay. Okay, consequences of not following God's word. That was laid out pretty clear. Both the obedience side and the consequence side. What else? With God you succeed, without him you fail. What else? That's right. All right. What else? Okay. So God is very consistent. Along those lines, I feel one of the strong messages was that God keeps his promises. He means what he says. Joshua pointed out to the people multiple times that he has kept his promises. And he did just as he said. And this lays out very clear here in the book of Joshua. Yes?
Early on, when the angel of the Lord appears to Joshua, it makes it very, very clear that it's not anything within Joshua that's going to get this job done. It's going to be the power of the Lord. And then later on, that comes to fruition. The last of the Canaanites are beginning to make excuses as to why they're not going to fight, why they're going to run, why they're going to scheme and do anything but fight, because they know it's the power of the Lord God Almighty, not necessarily the Israelites. So it becomes very clear not only to Joshua, but to all enemies as well.
And I think all these lessons, especially that one, are things we need to hear. Those are things we need to be reminded of, that of who's in control. And if you need a reminder that you're not in control, I don't know. You just need to hang out with me for a day or so. I think any parent realizes that. But boy, if things just went your way all the time, well, you could just hang out in the elders meeting here a while back. You can find out real quick you're not in control, because things don't go the way you would just love them to go all the time. And we need to realize that God's in control, and there's things about that we don't understand. His ways are higher than our ways. And there are things about the book of Joshua that we see from that. But clearly God is in control here, and we need to remember that. Okay, let's look at a few other themes. I appreciate that insight, and I hope that this study has been a reminder to you of some things. Let's look at a few other points that I just wanted to mention a few interesting facts here, and as it relates to Joshua. First of all, in Genesis chapter 50, there's this situation where it's really at the end, after Jacob died. Remember, Jacob had gone down to Egypt because Joseph was there. Joseph took care of them not only through the famine, but they ended up living down there. When Jacob died, Joseph's brothers were worried that Joseph was going to retaliate to them. Joseph doesn't. But notice verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. But then notice he was about to die. Verse 24, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land. They swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So there's this promise that Joseph, he didn't want to be permanently, he didn't want his bones permanently there in Egypt. He wanted them carried back to the land that was promised to his family, basically. So if you turn over to the end of Joshua 24, and notice verse 32, we did not get to this point last week. We talked about verse 31. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem in the place of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance to the descendants of Joseph. So it's neat there how his bones were carried back up to this area, and it's also interesting that his descendants inherited that piece of land, and just a neat little part of history there that I don't know whose job it was to carry those bones and watch them for all those hundreds of years or whatever, but it's neat that promise had been passed down from generation to generation and had done until they ended up here. So that legacy of Joseph had continued. The other thing I wanted to mention about Shechem, we mentioned this a few weeks ago, but turn back to Joshua chapter 8. Remember when after they had the sin of Achan and had the fall of Ai and basically defeated them totally. After that, they go to Shechem there, but they build this altar on Mount Ebal, and remember how he divided the children, and basically in verse 33, they had half of them in front of Mount Gerizim and half of them in front of Mount Ebal. And I don't know if you remember me showing a picture there of the two mountains, and basically Shechem is in the middle there. But here we see verse 32, and there in the presence of the people of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. Then notice verse 34, afterward he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse according to all that is written in the book of the law. There is not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before the assembly of Israel, and the men, the little ones, and the sojourners who lived among them. So there's several points where Joshua basically stops the people, and they recognize several things, and they always thank God. But here's one where he basically renews this covenant, renews the law of Moses, and makes, they had gone through, they defeated Jericho, but then they had this defeat themselves because of sin in the camp. But then they won, and after that, there was this time of thanking God, but kind of setting the covenant again. Well, Joshua turns around and does the same thing in chapter 24. So they're back to the same area, back to Shechem. And so the things that we talked about last week about choose you this day whom you're going to serve, that takes place basically back at the same general area. But again, he basically lays out before them the blessings and the cursings. He wants them to renew that covenant. And if you notice verse 25, so Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joseph wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the law that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. So there, before he dies, basically they're renewing this covenant at this special place again. So to me, that's worth pointing out, and I don't feel like I was able to bring that out last week. So the next thing I would like for us to look at for just a little bit are some of the references of Joshua, or some of the things in Joshua in the New Testament. So we'll just point out some of these fairly quickly. Chris has been covering the book of Acts, and we covered the Stephen's speech here a couple weeks ago. And in Acts 7, verses 44 through 48, remember as Stephen's kind of doing this history lesson of how God has been with his people all along the way, and how all these things are leading to basically Jesus. All these things are pointing to Jesus. Notice verse 44. Our fathers had the tent of witness. And I think some translations use the word tabernacle there. Had the tent or tabernacle of witness in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it, according to the pattern that he had seen. Our fathers in turn brought it with Joshua, when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers. So it was until the days of David. So God basically was dwelling with the Ark of the Covenant in this tabernacle, in this tent, and they would carry it with them wherever they went. And it was that way until the days of David. Verse 46, who found favor in the sight of God and who asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, as the prophet says. What other passage does that little phrase remind you of? How about Acts 17, when you have Paul in Athens, and he says, he's standing there before the Parthenon, and he says, our God does not dwell in temples made by human hands. So, again, this is pointed out. This is in part of Stephen's speech to them. It's part of the part that infuriated those that ended up stoning him. Chris pointed that out, that one of the things that fired them up was they felt like he was blaspheming the law and even this temple, this place that had become so holy to them. But here was Stephen saying, but God does not dwell in that temple there. He was telling them that, and that, of course, they got so mad about that they killed him. Another reference is Hebrews chapter 4, if you'll turn over there. Hebrews 4, verses 6 through 11. If we notice there, since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he points a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Remember, the book of Hebrews is written primarily to the Jews, and they put so much stock in the land there, in the land of Israel. But here, the writer of Hebrews saying is that Joshua, even though he'd gotten them into this promised land, had not given them rest. And what rest is that he's referring to? We're told, notice verse 9, so then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest. Turn over to Revelation 14:13 there. This will bring it to light. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on, blessed indeed, that they may rest from the labors, for their deeds follow them. So when we die in the Lord, we have eternal rest. That eternal rest ultimately comes through Christ. It's not because of the promised land. Christ brings that rest. And the book of Hebrews is trying to prove that Christ is better. That covenant is a better covenant. We're not going to read the passage, but in Hebrews 11, verses 30 and 31, we have the Hall of Fame of Faith. It's interesting that Joshua is not listed in the Hall of Fame of Faith, but it is mentioned that by faith the walls of Jericho fell down, and it also mentions Rahab. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had a friendly welcome to the spies. So, again, another reference to Joshua here in the New Testament. One other there in Hebrews 13:5, It's one of those, keep your life free from money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. It's interesting, what do you think of when Joshua says, I will never leave you or forsake you? You think of Joshua entering into the promised land, you think of danger and God's pledging, hey, I'm never going to leave you. But it's interesting that the writer of Hebrews applies that statement, I will never leave you or forsake you. What was the context there in Hebrews 13:5? Contentment, especially about money. Keep your life free from money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So that passage is applied to our contentment with money. Also in Joshua chapter 22, let's turn back there if you will. There's this passage, and we pointed this out real briefly last week, 22:5. There's this statement that Joshua says to the eastern tribes before they go back to their home. He says, only be very careful to observe the commandment and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. And what is that commandment? To love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, and to cling to him and serve him with all your heart, with all your soul. What does that remind you of? The greatest command. And of course, that's repeated by Jesus in several times. But again, the greatest command is to love the Lord your God. Now, it doesn't reference love your neighbor as yourself here, but he is reminded them of the greatest command, to love the Lord their God, serve him with all your heart and soul. I think this passage is an interesting, I won't say twist, but it exposes that command just a little bit more. To love him, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, and to cling to him and serve him with all of your heart and all your soul. Interesting words there. Now, as we kind of come to a close here, what I'd like to do is, boy, I wish that showed up a little bit better there. I didn't choose my colors good, but the one thing that I've mentioned several times, it's shown in Joshua chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, and then also in verse 9. There's this passage, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause the people to inherit the land I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and be courageous, being very careful to do all the law that my servant commands you. Do not turn from it from the right or to the left. Verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. So we're not going to have time to read all these. But there's a few passages where this takes place. First of all, it's told to Jacob about the land, really about the promised land. When he's to go off by himself, he's told basically to be strong and courageous. Jeremiah is one that he was encouraged to be courageous. Jeremiah had a tough time. He had a tough task to preach an unpopular message by God. And Jeremiah was told by God, do not say I'm only a youth, for to all whom I send you, you shall go, and whoever I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. I have down there later Deuteronomy 20 and also 31. This is then what was told to Moses, and what Moses said, be strong and courageous. But there's a couple key passages in Psalms. Just to quickly mention those to you. Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Psalm 46, verse 7. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. So we're told that God is with us wherever we go. Isaiah is a book we're going to study in Equipped this next year. We read this passage a few weeks ago, Isaiah 43, verse 1. Fear not, for I am redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. We sing that song sometimes. Verse 5, fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your offspring from the east, from the west I will gather you. We're told that. One last passage to bring out is Acts 4. If you will turn there with me, and this will be our last one we cover. Acts 4, 16 through 20. So even in the New Testament, there's this situation where Peter and John are brought before the Sanhedrin council. They were told, verse 15, when they commanded them to leave the council, they conferred with one another. And Chris covered this also a few weeks ago. What shall we do with these men? So in verse 17, but in order that it may spread no further among the people, let's warn them to speak no more to anyone in this name. So they called them and charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. Do you think Peter and John knew that God was with them? Do you think they were strong and courageous? They couldn't help but speak. It didn't matter what threats were made against them. And I guess that's what I hope that our study in Joshua does, is that if we don't get anything out of this, we know that God is with us. We should be wherever we go. One thing that the little video pointed out was when Joshua was before the commander of the Lord, the question was not, okay, were the Israelites going to be successful? The point was God was going to be successful. The question is, are we on God's side or not? Again, I appreciate the study. I appreciate your attention this quarter, and we'll look forward to 1 Chronicles with Stephen next quarter. Next Wednesday night, we'll be in here for a devotional and period of singing and prayer. Thank you much.